typically underinvest from the standpoint of what is good for society. That's why it's critically important that government get involved here too. One thing that government can do, and that some governments around the world in fact are trying, is to give companies a stronger incentive to invest in education. That one way of doing that is to give them a tax break. To the extent that a company trains its workforce, invests in training its workforce, they will pay less in taxes. That sort of creative policy on the part of government, I think, can be very effective in addressing inequality. But good question.
Due to the ongoing economic crisis, right, many high-paid as well as low-paid workers have been laid off to reduce firm costs. In Mexico, for example, do you think that this has had an effect in inequality through the structure of the labor workforce, for instance?
Yes. The short answer is typically a recession, especially a very severe recession like the one that we're still feeling the effects of, is going to hit people on the bottom harder than people at the top. Of course, everyone is affected to some extent, but it's the people on the bottom who feel it more, for two reasons. First, they are typically the first to lose their jobs, but perhaps more important, they are less able to afford losing their jobs than people who perhaps have some savings. And so just at the moment, the problem of inequality is even more acute than it would be if the global economy were strong. And that is why at a time of global recession, it's so important that there be social safety nets, that there be institutions like unemployment insurance, that there be adequate health care for people who lose their jobs, that there be opportunities for workers to get retrained for jobs where they might be able to get reemployed.
What effect has deterioration in the terms of trade for agricultural commodities have, because it has been at the lowest levels for the last 150 years?
Well, certainly another unfortunate effect of the recession has been the deterioration of agricultural prices. Fortunately, and this has aggravated the problem of inequality, because in many developing countries, most of the population is involved in agriculture in one form or another, and so inequality has grown worse as a result. Fortunately, though, this deterioration is almost certainly temporary. That is, once the global economy gets back to normal, we can expect a recovery of agricultural prices. The low levels that we're seeing at the moment are not going to persist forever. But your question touches on a serious long-term problem, which is that one of the problems with agriculture as a development strategy is that agricultural prices have tended historically to be very volatile. So at the moment they're low, sometimes they're very high, but in any case, they fluctuate a lot. And when prices fluctuate a lot, it's very difficult to plan for the future. When you're facing a lot of uncertainty, planning becomes difficult. And when a country is staking its economic future on something which is very uncertain, that makes development difficult. So what many developing countries have come around to is the view that, yes, agriculture is a good thing to develop, but it's important to also develop other things as a safeguard against price fluctuations. So a unilateral development strategy is likely to be too risky. Thanks for the question.
You were saying that education was the one of...
Sorry. I took a moment to figure out where the question was coming from.
You were saying that education was one of the solutions to this this big gap of inequality.
Right.
I would claim, since as it is a supply side policy, and it takes a long time to take effect, are there any short-term solutions to this problem?
I don't think there are any easy short-term solutions, short-term fixes. What I do think needs to be done in the short term, and this is particularly true now with the effects of a global recession still going on, is to build a social safety net, so that people who do not yet have global opportunities, because they do not yet have the skills that global markets demand, are not left out of the economic picture altogether. That is, they should still be able to get adequate housing, they should still be able to get adequate health care, they should still be able to get adequate food, at least at a minimal level. So social safety net is probably the most important short-term policy. In the long term, I'm afraid there's no real substitute for education.
Could you elaborate a bit on the mechanism design theory and how, as you've said before, it could be used to have prevented the recent economic crisis?
Okay, so this is shifting the direction a little bit, which is fine. I should have said that you should feel free, as you did, feel free to ask questions on anything. You don't just have to ask questions about inequality. So my main focus in my career has been on what's called mechanism design. And one way of thinking of mechanism design is that it's economics in reverse. So a lot of the time in economics, we look at existing institutions and we try to predict what kinds of outcomes those institutions will give rise to, what kinds of economic outcomes they will give rise to. In mechanism design theory, we reverse the direction. So we first look at outcomes. We say, what kinds of outcomes would we like to have? And then we ask, what kinds of institutions can we build which will achieve those outcomes? So that's mechanism design at a very general level. But you asked specifically about the this particular economic crisis that we are still trying to recover from, and what mechanism design could have done there. Well, I see, so just to recap what happened, the recession that we are now recovering from was brought on by a financial crisis, a crisis that had nothing to do with production or trade of goods and services. It was a problem largely involving banks. And the reason why these banks got into trouble is that financial markets, unlike most other markets, are not self-correcting. Unfortunately, that lesson that financial markets are not self-correcting was forgotten by many policymakers around the world, but it's a lesson which history has validated over and over. What do I mean by a self-correcting market? Well, take the market for rice, for example. If there's a drought in location A, and the rice crop in location A fails, that's a problem for the rice market. Supply of rice will fall as a result of that crop failure. But rice growers at location B and at location C now have an incentive to step in and provide more rice, because with the fall in rice supply, there will be an increase in the price of rice. So these other rice suppliers will jump in, provide more rice, and the initial problem, the crop failure, will be, at least to some extent, mitigated by the response of these other suppliers. That is an example of a self-correcting market. Now, what happens with banks? Well, suppose that some banks get into trouble, just as rice growers can get into trouble. Say that some banks got into trouble because they were making what are called subprime mortgage loans. That's how this particular financial crisis got started. So because these banks get into trouble, they have to call in their loans. They have to stop lending to many other borrowers who were actually making good use of their loans. So because some borrowers get into trouble and can't repay their, can't make their mortgage payments, banks have to call in loans to other borrowers who were completely up to date on their payments, but who suffer nonetheless because the bank itself is in trouble and can't afford to make these loans anymore. So these other borrowers have to repay their loans, but then that causes other banks to get into trouble because these other borrowers, having to repay some loans early, can't afford to pay other loans that they've received from these other banks. So these other banks get into trouble. And now we have a chain reaction where some banks getting into trouble cause other banks to get into trouble, and so on until we get into what's called a credit crunch, where no banks or essentially no banks, are making loans anymore. When that happens,